Hi there, and welcome to You and Your Business with me, Alec Drew, on Dublin City FM 103.2. Each week we have an expert from the world of business, sharing their knowledge, insights and tips, and helping you reduce costs, increase profits, and hopefully driving efficiencies. If there's a topic you'd like covered, or if you feel that you can make a contribution, please email me at yourbusiness@dublincityfm.ie, and perhaps we'll be chatting here one day soon. Today's guest heads up a company and she was founder of Persona Branding and Design, an international branding expert, professional speaker, writer, designer and mentor, who's been involved with brands such as Nestle, Aberley Luxury Yachts, the Law Society of Ireland, Radisson. Wow, what a portfolio. I'm delighted to welcome Lorraine Carter to the You and Your Business studio.
Alec, it's wonderful to be here.
It's great to have you here, Lorraine. I'll tell you, they're all household names here. Listen, I know you've been in the whole area of branding for more than 20 years. What kind of got you interested in that?
I was always fascinated by the history of where a brand came from. So if we go back to one of my biggest early clients when I set up the business would have been working with Dunnes Stores. Oh. And Dunnes Stores over 20 years ago was a very different organisation to what it is today. And the understanding of branding would have been very different, whereas now it's a very sophisticated organisation. And with really a brand that's radically changed from where it was over 20 years ago.
Yes, it's amazing. I mean, Dunnes Stores is a household name in Ireland, and the original founder, Ben Senior, wasn't it? Who talked about, he just talked about value and price, and that was it. He had nothing further to say. But I mean, even back then, it was a well-known household brand, but possibly didn't lever the amount of credibility it could have got had it been a bit more sophisticated.
That's why it's become so much more sophisticated. And you just, even if you take the grocery store experience now, I think personally that it's now the best offering there is in the local market in terms of that whole grocery retail experience, and the whole offering is very sophisticated. Probably
to the untrained eye, we tend to think of Dunnes Stores very much with that sort of green logo type. Have they changed much, or has it kind of morphed a lot over the years?
It has evolved, and that's not unusual with brands that have been around a long time. In order to stay relevant, they have to evolutionary update themselves as opposed to radically. So if you look at Dunnes over its history, you're going to see an evolutionary stages of progress in terms of how they've evolved their whole offering and how they appear, because branding isn't just about appearance.
It's one of those big challenges that I think a lot of CEOs and senior managers struggle with in terms of understanding what branding is actually about. Maybe could you give us some insights into it, because it's far more sophisticated than a lot of people tend to realise.
Well, one of the classic mistakes is thinking that branding is about logos, websites and brochures, but those are merely the visual identifiers. Branding is all about who you are, what you stand for, why you exist, how you're different, and why you are the perfect choice for your ideal customers. So there's a whole strategy behind every really strong, powerful brand. And that in turn then provides the direction for all those visual expressions in terms of the logo, the photography, the design. That all takes its direction from the strategy.
It's amazing. I think one of the things I've met a number of people in design over the years, and one of the things they keep constantly saying to me is that everybody's a designer in their own mind, and that presents a challenge.
That would be true, and I think you could also say there's a lot of misunderstanding around branding, that everybody thinks they're in the business of branding, and they're often talking about design execution as opposed to brand strategy, which then means for particularly a lot of business leaders, the misinformation in the market means they have a misunderstanding unless they've got a heavyweight CMO, chief marketing officer, who's really putting things straight through the organisation. Design is an aspect, but it comes further down the food chain in the process.
Yes, I mean, where do companies start? Because they're out there, and I suppose it starts at a board meeting. Somebody thinks we need either to look fresh or we're setting up a new entity. So where do you start? I mean, with somebody, an expert like yourself in this, they bring you in, and what happens?
The first thing we're looking at, really, Alex, is we're looking at where has the brand come from? What's its history? So we actually do what we call effectively a brand health check, or a brand audit, to use jargon.
All right.
And we're looking at the whole history of the brand, where it's come from, its competitors in the marketplace. We're evaluating it against benchmarking industry standards and trends. We're looking at what are the key business objectives. So we're evaluating all of that. And then that feeds into the next stage of the process, is where we're completely reevaluating the brand strategy. And that's actually made up of 10 key elements, believe it or not.
All right.
Yeah, so there's a substantial body of work, but we actually approach this from very much an agile branding mindset. So instead of the more traditional approach, which might stretch over, 6 to 9, 12 months and longer, we look at it intensively as a very intensive process. And we will work with leadership team and get fully immersed with them in mapping out those 10 key areas that make up their brand. So that starts with things like your brand purpose. What's your reason for existence in the world, and what's your compelling reason for not only for customers to buy, but also for people to want to work with your organisation, because people are driven by bigger things than just making money.
Yes, and I suppose actually the sort of questions that you're asking there are very valid for a lot of companies who actually never take the time out even to ask themselves. So a branding exercise like that might unearth some hidden gems. Or
it does all the time. I mean, I'm just back from working with a company in the UK, and we had working with the leadership team, and minimum time frame we're looking at is a 2 full days intensive immersion. And typically stuff comes up to be discussed. It's not necessarily part of the agenda, but has an impact on the business performance. So we end up strategically, we might be looking at performance issues in the business. We might dig into other areas that wouldn't necessarily directly come into the brand strategy, but they still directly impact the business performance. But there are 10 key areas we work through, and often the other things, like you've just mentioned, they typically come up for discussion as well.
I'd say they do. It must be at some cases like turning over a stone and seeing what crawls out from underneath it. It's a mindset. But okay, so you've got involved, and again, my understanding, but again, having a slightly different perspective on it, there's always a perception that branding is an expensive exercise. But I'm sure it's more to do with the actual collateral out of it is more the challenges.
We take a lean approach to make big brand know-how very accessible to SME businesses, because typically brand strategy in its fuller sense is really something that would be a bigger investment for, and consequently more accessible to larger entities and organisations. So we take a leaner approach to make it accessible to SMEs. So we cut that down to a very intensive time frame. So when we're working with the leadership team and, let's say, working out their brand strategy, that's done over a 2-day process, and we capture all those raw outputs and then come back to them. It's a co-collaborative process. It's far more effective than because we have the leadership team participating in the process, and we capture the raw outputs, and that then provides all the direction for the decisions around marketing campaigns and design execution. And it also makes decisions in the business people have a much better reference point, so they have much more clarity, so they can make decisions faster and more effectively.
Just if you're joining us now, you're listening to me, Alec Drew, on Dublin City 103.2 FM, where my studio guest is Lorraine Carter, founder of Persona Branding and Design, sharing her knowledge on the important subject of design and branding, and naturally enough. And where can people find out more about you, Lorraine?
Oh, they can get us at personadesign.ie.
Personadesign.ie, okay, well that kind of helps them a lot. You were talking about SMEs, but a lot of our listeners would be sort of mid-corporates. Does the same strategy work for them? Or is
yes,
it just...
it does, because we're taking what effectively would be the thinking often used by large organisations, and we've compressed it and made it into a more agile, accessible model for smaller business. But exactly, even when we're working with larger organisations, we apply the same process. It just expands out slightly differently because they've bigger resources to work with.
And I suppose part of the overall strategy, as I talked about the collateral, which would be the brochures and would be the website and all of that it has a knock-on effect. So
totally. All of those areas, the brochures, the website, the video campaigns, the ads, even your sales scripts and how you train up your team, brand induction, empowering your team to become brand and champions, all of that comes from fundamentally your brand strategy, because the direction and outputs all come from that. Where we get down to the details of what is the appropriate language for the brand and how does it express itself in a way that's compelling and highly attractive to your particular target audience.
I suppose one of the real challenges must be when somebody like an expert like yourself comes in and the management team sit down to maybe examine the branding of a particular organisation, that it can be a bit unsettling for staff not knowing what's going on. How do you...
We typically start with the senior management in an organization because these are strategic decisions, but we then very quickly get involved the rest of the team, because if you want to initiate change and transformation, whether that's a very small evolutionary change, whether you want to go with something that's more radical, for that to be effective, you have to get everybody throughout the business on board, and culture change is one of the most difficult things to affect. So you actually need to get people involved relatively early on, once you've got the key strategic bigger decisions more strongly mapped out.
That's an interesting thing you brought in, the word there, culture. Explain that in a bit more detail, because people sometimes misinterpret what that means in an organisation.
Well, culture is made up of effectively how the brand expresses itself. If we were to boil it down to things, it includes things like your bigger brand purpose, your vision, what's your future destination and where you want to get to, and your mission, which is the actions you take on a daily basis, and the experiences you create, not just amongst yourself but amongst your customers, and the values. These are the standards you live by on a daily basis. They're the standards that are not compromisable, and the promise that on which you'll deliver on a daily basis, the promise you make to your customers. All of that then feeds into how your brand culture manifests, and how that's expressed in terms of how people deal with each other, because every brand also has a personality. So you could have a brand that's got a very formal, maybe traditional corporate personality, and then you could have a brand that's, maybe definitely less formal, got a much younger approach. All of those impact on the culture of your organisation.
And I suppose it has a knock-on effect, as you said. If there's something much younger and sort of more appealing and fun, it's likely to attract a particular type of person to go and work for that company.
Yeah, absolutely, because that brand ultimately also, you've touched on a really relevant one, particularly in the current marketplace, and it's become a bigger issue, would be employer brand. An employer brand, again, feeds out of brand strategy, and you're amplifying key aspects of it to attract top talent and also to retain top talent, because that is a big challenge in the marketplace now.
Well, it certainly is. And people tend not to think of those aspects of investing in something like branding. They just see the sort of initial expense and then think, well, what am I really getting for it? I mean, in terms of, what does a brand give you?
I mean, effectively, a brand gives you, when you've got a really strong brand, it gives you much greater influence in the marketplace. You stand out far more effectively. So you have stronger differentiation. That means you can typically charge higher premiums or margins for what you offer, so you have more profitability. It gives you a competitive advantage. Of course, you attract and retain your top talent. And it also eliminates one of the big problems, particularly when you look at consumer goods, of commoditization, whereby if you don't give your customers a really compelling reason to buy, they just default to a price-based decision, which is the worst place to be. And then ultimately, if you build a really strong, powerful brand, it becomes a valuable piece of intellectual property. And that in itself gives you a whole range of choices. And then, of course, if you've got a really strong, successful brand, you can actually build and leverage other product solutions off it, because they then leverage off that reputation by association. And then you just have a bigger market impact. You're leading the marketplace, and you have a platform on which to leverage multiple other choices.
You often hear the expression, this is only for bigger companies. Sure, what would the likes of us want with a brand? I suppose you come across that on a fairly regular basis.
Less so now, to be honest with you, Alec, because people are more conscious of brand. Brand has become a much bigger issue, and the whole environment and marketplace because of online. So we have a plethora of choice. If you take 20 years ago, the big influences on brand were TV, radio, and advertising. Well, those channels are radically challenged by other routes to market, and businesses now, small businesses, have access to the marketplace and routes to market to their customer base, which they didn't have even 10 years ago. So when you have a little bit more knowledge within the business, the agility with which you can do things far more effectively means you can run a far more successful and profitable business if you have a strong brand in place.
What are the sort of mistakes to avoid around branding?
Well, we've covered one of the big ones, and that is the thinking that your logo is a brand.
Right.
But the other one is not identifying and mapping out your brand strategy. So that was when I mentioned, your purpose, vision, mission, values, because those are what gives your customer a compelling reason to buy. And that brings me on to a really important issue here in terms of, doesn't matter whether you're male or female or what your cultural reference point is. Everybody makes decisions to buy that are emotionally based. So 60% of branding is about perception, and only 40% is actually about your product or service. So if you want to win customers, you actually have to touch the heart first in order to move the mind. So when you're building out a brand, we're looking at human psychology. How are we going to emotionally engage that ideal target audience to give them a compelling reason to buy, so they're no longer defaulting to price-based decisions? And that's whether you're selling a product or a service, B2B or B2C.
Right. And again, give me a few ideas around challenges around branding.
Well, typically challenges that people would face would be they're struggling to differentiate, or they're getting caught up in price wars. That's a big one. Or sometimes, I mean, if I take some of the clients we're working with, they're service-based businesses, and even one of the things we've been evaluating in the brand audit health check process is looking at how they put their proposals together. And we're completely reevaluating those and some of the changes they need to make so that they actually highlight the added value they're bringing, because they're defaulting to price-based decisions. And price wars are a big problem, and discounting. And then customers sometimes make decisions to rebrand, but they haven't necessarily got a really solid basis around making that decision. They haven't necessarily got clarity. And you don't want to be throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
No, certainly not. No.
So sometimes we kind of go, well, let's rein it back. Is this like an evolutionary update, or is there a radical reason for change? Because it needs to be looked at judiciously. And then just failing to attract your ideal customers. One of the common mistakes we see is that businesses don't map out their different customer types, and every business has a minimum of 2, but can have up to 20 different customer profiles. And if you don't map them out in detail, if you don't understand your customers' needs, wants, loves, hates and aspirations, it's very difficult to build a compelling brand that really resonates with them.
If you're joining us now, you're listening to me, Alec Drew, on Dublin City 103.2 FM. We're at my studio guest, Lorraine Carter, founder of Persona Branding, where we're talking about branding and all that goes with it. And it's a fascinating story, and certainly has our audience really engaged in what's happening here. Every company has a story to tell.
They do.
And they tend to forget it.
They tend to forget the value and importance of that. And if you think about this, we are programmed. We've been telling stories since we were living in caves, but we're hardwired to make sense of the world through story. And most businesses, particularly whether you're small or large, have a compelling story in which they originated or how they came into being. And your story is a way of sharing that with the marketplace in a way that's compelling to your customer base. And then that story evolves over time, and often I'll find that businesses haven't leveraged that to its full potential. And when you have a really strong story that resonates with people at an emotional level, it becomes very memorable and referable, and the marketplace shares it for you, and it helps your brand reach further.
As you know, we've met up on a number of occasions, but there's one thing I've always noticed. You always wear the same colour, type of cerise or some colour, or is there a particular
I do
colour?
like a rather strong pink, Alec, that's right.
But that's part of the branding. That's your brand.
It is part of my brand, yeah. And part of the company brand. Pink features in all our brand visual communications.
Yeah, so it's important to have a consistency of look and feel about the whole business.
Yeah. It comes down to the visual expression. Even if you take, let me give you an example. If you take a funeral directors, now you might think they all have to wear black. But one of our clients, when we were reevaluating the business, I said, how would you feel if we introduced a little bit of colour to differentiate you visually from all the other funeral directors out there? And they had to think about it. But then they agreed to it. And the men all wear dark purple ties and the ladies all wear branded purple scarves. So they stand out from all the other funeral directors in the marketplace. And that's a very conservative, traditional business.
Well, it just shows you if you can get funeral undertakers to move away from black and white, you're doing well on that. You must have a sort of favourite brand or something up there. I know I don't want to get you involved in too much controversy. We don't have a fight with your own clients up there. But you must have a brand that kind of resonates a bit with you.
I really admire what Emmett Savage and his team are doing from they're a fintech business, and The business was called, when they founded it originally, Rubicon, and they've just recently renamed it to My Wall Street. And they are making, their mission is to make investing, stocks and shares, accessible to the everyday person. And they're really doing a phenomenal job, and I really admire what they're doing. And it's an example of a business, a startup, doing things on a lean basis, but doing it very effectively.
And when they approached you, under what were they trading? Was it Rubicon?
It was Rubicon, yeah. They've literally only just changed to My Wall Street in the last week or so.
Yeah, well, I mean, My Wall Street, there's a great name.
Isn't
for
it?
Yeah. That just, it says it all on the
It
tin
does,
there.
doesn't it?
You know exactly what they're doing. So what piece of advice would you give to medium-sized companies who are kind of sitting in the wing and thinking to themselves, oh, we'll wait to see if we've budget till the end of the year? How does this conversation start off?
I would say to them, before you launch into any more visual assets or marketing campaigns, be really clear about your brand strategy. And one of the tips I would pass on is think about every customer, regardless of B2B or B2C, has got problems, and how are you solving them? But don't look at just the obvious external problem, because that's typically what most businesses address, the generic and obvious. You need to also consider what are their internal problems and the philosophical ones, because when you dig down deep to that, they will just have a much stronger sense of, these guys really understand what I'm at, and they are the solution for us. So if you, to give you an example of what that means in real terms, you could say an external problem is, we have unhappy customers and our competitors are outperforming us and sales have dropped for XYZ reason in this sector. That's a very generic. But if you look at that and we say for example, a client of ours, it could be saying, our brand just isn't working. We need something to make it work or build it out. Maybe we need a refresh or rebrand. That's an external obvious problem. But if we look at that internally, we could say, they could be saying, I don't know if I know enough about branding. I want to be a lot more informed and in control. Can we do this successfully? I want to make sure. So those are the internal uncertainties. And then you've got the philosophical ones of, our brand should be achieving X, Y, Z. I shouldn't need to have a master's in branding to be effective and to have a powerhouse brand. But when you address all those different pain points, you become a far more compelling proposition to your ideal customers. But you have to understand who your ideal customer is in order to dig down to those pain points and then be able to communicate in their terms in a way that they find irresistible.
Yes, it must be a challenge finding the right clients and clients who actually understand it. I was handed not too long ago a brochure, and it was a typical one taken up a headquarters with cars parked outside. But the one thing I noticed, there wasn't a car less than 30 years old in the picture. So it suggested that they hadn't done very much in a long time. I suppose you have to watch these little things.
Well, what are they selling? It comes back to, what are they selling?
Well, they weren't selling cars, I can tell you.
Exactly. So why is that picture on the front of their brochure?
Oh my goodness me, gosh only knows. Listen, there must be challenges. Again, you've been involved in some of the leading world brands like Nestle. What are the sort of challenges working there? Because there's obviously some sort of brand architecture overstrapping everything. So how do you...
Well, then you see, because when you've got big brands like Nestle or Virgin or Kerry Foods, you've got to look at localization. You've got to adapt for local markets, because what might sell in the Irish market may not sell for cultural reasons well in the Indian market. So you've got to localize, and you might have some product ranges that work in one jurisdiction that don't sell at all in another, or they're presented completely differently to the market. So you can never make the assumption that the strategy that you have working in the UK and Ireland is going to work effectively on another continent, or even if a Western jurisdiction. You could say, let's look at, say, continental Europe and a French or Italian market. You can't make the assumption that the strategy developed and deployed in the UK or Ireland is going to work in those jurisdictions. So you do have to have localization to be effective.
Yes, and people, I think, they need to take cognizance. I saw our good friends who've been in the news quite recently, BAM, there you are, a green, white and orange branding. and I know they were involved in some tendering process in the north, so that should have been quite interesting.
Well, yeah, quite possibly, yes.
Anyway, we won't steer ourselves into that conversation. Brands that you like, Apple, they must always feature in there as frequently when I'm running in-house workshops or even open masterminds, and I'll have one of the questions I'll ask participants is, name a few brands that you like or dislike and give the reasons why.
And Apple always comes up, but then let's face it, it's a $1 trillion brand, or at least it was, certainly hit that point last year. So it's one of the most successful brands out there. And even if you go back and look at some of the early Steve Jobs videos still are visible online, and he had an absolute clarity of what Apple was all about from a brand proposition point of view. And when he came back to Apple, he stripped out the product range and he got really clear about what the offering it is. And those principles are still true today.
And it's interesting that their offering has always been very simple and nearly intuitive to people. Their original, if I remember correctly, going back a long time, their branding was not Apple, but had a series of different colours and bars.
Well,
and
I mean, you're talking about aesthetics here, but if you go back to even earlier, the way in which Apple presents itself now is not the same as it did then, because if you go back to the really early days of Apple, it was much more of a professional user brand.
Sure.
So the positioning, its messaging was very different to what it is now, which is much more a consumer-faced business. And so the messaging is much more about how Apple enhances your lives. But it never defaulted into, if you go back to the early stages of other competitor brands, which would have sold on how much storage space there was on the device or how fast it moved, which in emotional terms is not very compelling, particularly if you're not techie.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you what, they certainly found their marketplace and had, as you said, clarity of delivery on what they wanted to say to its audience. Yeah. And they built up a very, very successful and loyal audience over all those years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, very definitely so.
Well, I suppose we could be talking all day, but I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. A special thanks to our guest, Lorraine Carter of Persona Branding and Design, and for coming into the You and Your Business studio today. Thanks to Pia on sound. Don't forget that you can contact the show by emailing your business at dublincityfm.ie with your contents and suggestion. The podcast Today Show will be available soon on dublincityfm.ie. And thank you for your company, and please remember to join me, Alec Drew, again next week at the same time, 12:30, right here on 103.2 Dublin City FM for another edition of You and Your Business.